Hello everyone, today we talk about Medieval Abruzzo. This is a very important episode in our historical regional series because even though I've already made videos that do not pertain strictly to the communal side of the medieval Italian civilization, we never began to observe in detail the Abruzzo is central Italy, but let's say there is a broader southern Italian sphere. If anything, we can also describe how different linguistical areas, the so-called Neapolitan dialect applied in a more regional rather than strictly the city of Naples sense, also encompasses parts of central Italy in the north part of which, for example, are also witnessing Gallo-Italic once. So this is not what we're going to do specifically. If you're interested in European linguistics in a broader, also provincial sense, and individual historical regions, we can really discuss it in another video. But the point being that aside from medieval Sicily, that I really made multiple videos on, dedicated especially to the various dominations, right, of Sicily, we never really discussed any other region of the broader south, right? Again, Abruzzo mostly pertains to central Italy. It's very close to Rome. If anything, we made a video about the famous Battle of Tagliacozzo that really took place in the Abruzzese mountains, and as you know, together with Benevent and Markfield, was literally one of the single most important big and sort of tactically relevant, also strategically, politically relevant battles in medieval Europe. I was the only one making a video about that. Just, consider what kind of supposedly cultural perspective, the broader YouTube historical, pseudo-historical community actually has. If anything, we have been very thorough as far as the single Italian city-states of the center and the north were. We made also videos about general provinces. Here, for example, the Duchy of Spoleto also interfered with Abruzzo and covered part of it. But we have to open a bit more to these more southern provinces, which I'll probably be mixing into, in fact, the rest of medieval Italian history. We have to cover still lots of other communes. Then at some point, as for other parts of Europe, we'll switch to the various houses, different rulers, because I think we're going to exhaust at some point, not soon, but we may have already passed the majority, the half, some properly more biographical content, which of course also is more active, is more also transcendent at the specific geographical dimensions. In any case, as for the other series here, we will start from antiquity. And Abruzzo is not, let's say, of course, an unimportant region historically. As we'll see now, there's a lot to say. If anything, however, is considered in a secondary sense. It was never a single sort of big power developing from these areas. That's exactly why I want to actually go in great depth, given that these are sort of, in part, standalone videos, right? They're part of a series that go in chronological order, but as we've always seen, we do it for the inherent value of the province, almost in a touristic sense, not just in a historical one. I mean, highlighting their importance and how replete certain, in fact, allegedly secondary regions actually are in terms of civilizational legacy. You know that on Schwerpunkt we're very sensitive to this topic. Essentially, if you look at pop culture, that is supposed to be, there is a radical and magnitudinal disconnect in disproportion between the importance, let's say, the popularization of specific parts of the world and Europe in history, at the detriment of areas that are actually equally traumatically overloaded with civilizational legacy that nobody talks about. And I think that Abruzzo pertains to some of this. We can pronounce it different ways. I think the most common terminology in English is the plural Abruzzi, and this refers to also the different elements that came to compact this region historically. Naturally, we deal with the Middle Ages, and we're going to stick to that. But starting from antiquity, because these are areas in Southern Europe and in Italy in particular that, of course, have an extraordinary continuity with ancient civilization. In fact, this more provincial world where there's hardly any major center, if not created, in fact, or redeveloped in medieval times. But it's also one of the most sheltered in Europe, and therefore better preserved in terms of ancient and medieval settlements. Reason for which I think is a must for our channel. So let's dive essentially in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, as Abruzzo is really rewarding as far as this is concerned. In 165 AD, during the consulship of Lucius Arius and Marcus Gavius Orfitus, we are essentially in Antonine times, the thriving commercial activity of centers, Abruzze's, what would become Abruzze's centers in Anxanum, that is today's Lanciano, was documented, for example. Lucius Arius and Marcus Gavius Orfitus were Roman consuls serving as chief magistrates of the Roman Republic that oversaw the administration of the region during this period of prosperity. This was essentially the best period to be a Roman, but also an Abruzzese Roman in particular. A significant record from the era of Marcus Aurelius, so we are the same years between 161 and 180, known for his, of course, philosophical writings and stable rule, granted citizens named Fisio, Eucanio, Feltro, Rota, Tilio, and Audo the right to oversee the market of public fairs in Abruzzo, highlighting the city's economic vitality. Moving forward to the second phase of the Roman Empire, the Marsi region, that was named after the Marsi tribe, that was one of the fiercest in or the fiercest according to Roman standards. We were talking about it just the other day as far as the Italic naval activity was concerned before Roman conquest, faced a gradual decline. Right, the Marsic, as we will see now, will remain a historical region of central Italy. Here, what would become Abruzzo was essentially the Samnium. Eventually, there would be particular repartitions. In any case, we're looking at a general decline occurring throughout the 3rd century crisis. Also, natural disasters, famines, naturally man-made, but also nature-made at some point, earthquakes, such as the one in 346 AD, Constantinian era, the broader Constantinian dynastic sense. Flooding and neglecting maintenance of Claudius channels designed to regulate the Fucinus Lacus flow caused the outlet to overflow, turning the area into a marshy and healthy zone. This is particularly relevant because, as you know, the Lake Fucino today is a plain. It's been in the contemporary era dried up, reclaimed. But during the Middle Ages, after Roman times, the major infrastructural stemming waters had collapsed, and this area was literally a white lake. So this happened gradually to an extent, and you can say that, of course, the late antique decline showed in these areas that were, as we've seen, not overwhelmingly strategic or central, and that in any case continued to witness the Roman civilization throughout these centuries. The Claudius channels take the name after Claudius, the Roman emperor 41 to 54, who had initiated these ambitious engineering projects, constructing the channels to drain the Fucinus Lacus. Post-earthquake restorations are evidenced in Alba Fucens, that is one of the most beautiful Roman archaeological sites of the whole empire, where I inserted some pictures of that as well in the midst of the Abruzzese mountains, where the urban layout with layered architectural features clearly shows the transition from the Augustan era of the first century to the late period. Right? These were places where you think, again, this is just an archaeological site in a town into the Abruzzese mountains. They held naumachis by flooding the local arena, and in the local church that was used as essentially the housing for the actual gladiators that would fight in these clashes. There is a fresco literally on this is a church today, and inside the church the wall bears like the drawing of one of these gladiators depicting a very well neatly shaped ship, like the ones that were fighting in the adjacent arena. By the way, is intact. It's one of the best preserved in the Roman Empire. It's something shocking in its beauty and pretty indicative of the complete lack of comparisons in terms of just general fame of archaeological sites in the world. In the late 4th century, in the Marsican capital of Marruvium, construction work was undertaken, and the first chapel of Saint Sabina was erected there, which later became the cathedral seat of the diocese of the Marsica. This church would unfortunately go lost in a 1915 earthquake, but it is at least very well documented, both sort of graphically, archaeologically, and more in its authentic sort of aspect. During the reign of Emperor Constantine, who ruled between 306 to 337, who, as you know, legalized Christianity and founded Constantinople on Byzantium, Anxanum in Abruzzo was also restored to its former grandeur, running a parallel with Constantinople, well, pretty random one, but this happened by the will of local elites, as a notable stone tablet inscribed with Antonius Justinianus, Rector Provinciae, shows. Around this time, a significant development across what was called as Abruzzium, including the Marsi, was the arrival of Christians and their subsequent martyrdom. This is at least a moment in which Christian communities spread more freely and therefore can take root in the land. The most compelling case in the Marsi region is in Trasacum, where the remains of Saint Rufinus of Assisi, an early Christian martyr venerated as a saint, and Saint Cecidius, another martyr associated with the spread of Christianity in the region, are still preserved, with veneration beginning immediately, though the earliest records of their dedicated church date to the Berardi Dominion in the 11th century. This would be the future counts of the Marsica in a very different, sort of more Lombard Norman context in the High Middle Ages. In 1410, Alaric I's Visigoths stormed Rome and ravaged other parts of Italy, including Abruzzium, entering through Interamnia Praetutiorum, where they remained until 552-554. This is quite relevant because it shows how the Goths in Italy were not just the ones of Theodoric, that Alaric's passage was not merely meteoric. Some Gothic federati had been installed eventually by the same Romans, especially in these strategic areas, at least of the Apennines. We here said that, of course, Abruzzo was not much of a strategic place, say, in the moment in which the Pax Romana ruled over, 3 continents. But, of course, in late antiquity, Italy was sort of remilitarized, and the Apennine passes, including the Abruzzese ones, became of pivotal strategic relevance. And historically, as it happened with the Goths, these ones and the Ostrogoths and Longobards, as other settlers, by the way, they were usually, in fact, installed as garrisons, guarding the Apenninic and also in the North Alpine passes All right, in part they were separated from the more Roman world. They sort of espoused more easily the more primitive and traditional Italic Apenninic backbone that, after all, was not even that overwhelmingly distant historically from the older Indo-European migrations that followed exactly the same pattern as we've seen in other videos about the topic. Alaric I, however, as the Visigothic king who led to the sack of Rome, had also orchestrated widespread plunder across these regions. And even though this sack was, as you know, a bit more tempered than the other ones, as the Goths still rightly feared Rome and in fact abandoned the same Italy for a safer settlement in areas like Aquitaine on the Atlantic. At the time was not even this explosion of advancement. Really shows you how still complex the relations between Rome, the Federati really were, how much a Romanity, especially in Italy, was still vivid and still the backbone, in fact, also of the later domination of the peninsula at the end of the day. The term Abruzzium, that as you understand is Abruzzo, originates from the Roman territory of Praetutium in the Interamnia Praetutiorum region, previously part of the Picenum, which would be today's market, by the way. As we've seen during especially the Augustan partition, Abruzzo was part of the Samnium, but there is a sort of frontier dimension, and the various districts also change over time with, for example, the late antiquity administrative reorganizations. And the term Abruzzium per se first appears rather in medieval records. All right, it would have been used in antiquity, but it was mostly popularized later as Abruzzo was in fact to enucleate as a region on its own, reflecting, however, its also older historical roots. In 476, the Marsi that, as we've seen, occupied great parts of modern Abruzzo, faced further challenges as Odoacer, who seized Rome by deposing Romulus Augustus, invaded the Robur Valles via the Liri River. Odoacer was actually just Germanic chieftain at the head of the already essentially Federatus army of Italy that would famously end the formality of the western half of the Roman Empire during this invasion that witnessed the settlement of some further war bands over time. Right. As you know, after Odoacer's defeat at the hands of Theodoric the Great, the latter Ostrogoths took over the military control of Italy in an otherwise continuously civilly governed Italian peninsula within the Roman Empire. Under Gothic rule, parts of Abruzzium, particularly Teate, retained Roman traditions and prospered. As you know, Gothic Italy is the greatest success of Romano-Germanic integration in the entire migration era. Besides, at this point, the Abruzzese church was really taking shape in a more consistent fashion. In the aforementioned Teate, temples were converted into Christian worship sites, including the Cathedral of St. Mary Major, built over the Temple of Mars, and now the St. Justin Cathedral, the Church of Saints Peter and Paul over the Temple of the Dioscuri, the square of the small temples, and the construction of St. Agatha of the Gods Chapel, still standing in the Gate St. Mary district of Teate. These are definitely incredibly precious archaeological marvels of the era. In the 6th century, however, with the Gothic War, the Marsica was invaded first by the Byzantines and then by the Lombards. Especially the Gothic War with Constantinople was a disaster for Italy that, as you know, was run a couple of times back and forth by the contending armies, triggering major social upheaval, widespread destruction. The Samnium province in particular, including Abruzzium, fell to Belisarius, that had led the first wave of conquest that would have also basically ended the war there if he hadn't been removed from command and the Gothic coming back from northern Italy hadn't sprang forth once again as a consequence. As you know, Belisarius, as a prominent Byzantine general under the Emperor Justinian, was the plenipotentiary of the Italian, the reconquered Italian lands at this point, but he was eventually removed by the eunuch Narses because of possible fears of coups in Constantinople, which would have been kind of a real possibility. In fact, the real catastrophe happens rather later, right? In 539, a devastating famine struck the Interamnia Praetutiorum region, allegedly killing 50,000 farmers, which seems rather excessive, right? When you look at, especially the general population of post-Roman Western Europe, you realize that each of these countries had basically millions of people. It doesn't matter how intense also the later Justinian plague struck these quite strongly populated areas. At least Abruzzo was mostly a mountainous region, but in general, also by European standards, it was a pretty advanced southern territory, as we have also witnessed through urbanization, general production. Besides, the first hints of an increasingly oppressive Byzantine taxation policies caused a general alienation from what was evidently not a Roman enterprise anymore, given that the actual Romans were the Italians historically. And in fact, many of these people in Abruzzo would abandon entire rural communities. In part, they went depopulated because of the war of the plague, but many decided, as we'll see later, to also go live into the Lombard territories that were much less sort of oppressive, incentivizing settlement. And while continuing government under essentially a Roman base, they had also molded this in a more Germanic, to a greater Germanic degree, where individual freemen had sort of greater autonomy, differently from Byzantine society. And so especially like after the collapse of the latifundium during the Gothic War, many Roman colonists preferred to eventually become Lombard and living more or less equated to them. Also, under the Ostrogoths, it was actually a rigid hierarchy, in as much as the Gothic people were really different socially from the Lombards, and more Romanized. By 543, chaos resurfaced with further barbarian incursions severely affecting Abruzzium. The Gothic War had deeply destabilized this already precarious social order, exacerbated by further earthquakes. As a very, even in recent years, as you know, central Italy, Abruzzo, has been hit by severe earthquakes, destroying some, in fact, of this older towns, right? And following the war's conclusion, Abruzzium was, however, temporarily secured under Byzantine control, right? There is limited evidence surviving in relics from the ruined churches of Ortona and Istonium. The former is, the one of the Canadians of World War II, like the Stalingrad of Italy. And it's really the same places that have this rich history. So we're talking here Byzantine evidence, a sort of interregnum, so to say, between the Goths and Lombards, contrary to how, in fact, Justinian's broader universal reconquest would have conceived the retaking of Italy. Also, the Cracium area has some of that kind. Artifacts, in particular, are of those generations, are housed in the permanent collection of the Museum of Byzantine and Early Medieval Abruzzo at the Rizais ducal castle. Little remains of the Byzantine presence in Abruzzo, however. All right, in part because, as we've seen, the hinterland was less relevant to the Byzantines and mostly controlled the coastal areas. But even there weren't overwhelming centers that the Byzantines was stuck in the defense of for long, especially after the Longobards started to settle literally in many of them, and especially in the broader hinterland. The Byzantines, in order to retain control on this de facto foreign land, given their Greek, say, Eastern background, they had fortified especially the ports of the Italian coastline. The one St. Vitus Teatinus, well, here we could technically use the Italian names because we're switching to the Middle Ages in general, right? Teatinus, by the way, means of theater, which stands for Chieti, that is one of the major settlements in Abruzzo. Also, the Byzantines still, let's say, continue part of the traditional, for example, villas building resembling the Roman domus in the nearby countryside of St. Vito. The latifundium partially remains in Byzantine Italy, but it's much smaller than before. It's gradually being eroded by all the dynamics we will see now. But in any case, in this specific in-between of Byzantine rule, we seen at least some villas, but we don't have to think the extensive latifundia across different countries, but still connected with the broader Byzantine trade. Archaeological findings of such infrastructures have been found in the regions of Crecchio, Tollo, and Canosa Sannita, as well as in Pescara, where the Byzantines erected a small rudimentary fort to protect the port as well. So nothing special, right? Also something that really by the 6th century, given the enormous material poverty in the world, was enough to fence off some attacks, at least the minimal ones, raids. There would have been brigands, as we'll see now. There were already, some war bands roaming without Byzantine control. This alongside necropolises containing metal helmets, so Byzantine equipment, and again, some basically localized kind of settlement that will increasingly head also towards the direction that Longobards will give to Roman Italy. The Byzantines also took control of Monte Pagano in Roseto degli Abruzzi and advanced to Torricella Peligna in the upper Aventine Valley, likely occupying the ancient Carricini city of Juvanum. So this, the Peligni, the Carrucini, etc., these were all ancient Italic peoples whose districts had historically remained with their municipia, their genes, their tongues, where the Byzantines also established settlements in the highlands, founding, for example, the medieval stronghold of Torricella Peligna, which means little tower of the Peligni, and Monte Nero Domo. This is interesting because we're saying Byzantine here, and there would have been Greek Oriental officials ruling, but of course there was a local establishment favoring this, in the broader expectation of the continuation of a Roman rule, at least according to some degrees that were different from the broader Byzantine world. But tensions existed. In fact, Byzantine occupation was not favorable, as the political and economic environment was perpetually unstable, marked by plunder, destruction, and kidnappings, carried out probably by the local Abruzzese at a point as well, given the fact that, as we've seen here, the Byzantines were foreigners in a Roman land. And this is literally what we're looking at, if you think about it, that medieval Italy was never essentially connected to a Greek system. People have some strange ideas regarding, for example, the Southern Italian, for example, Greek-speaking minorities. There, first of all, a high medieval thing is like a Komnenian time repopulation. They're a minimal fraction of the population. I mean, compared to, the Albanians or the Ladins or the Catalans or the St. Germans of Tyrol, the Occitanians, they're minimal. But for some reason, there's this notion that Italy is connected to Greece more. It is, and also somehow particularly ethnically varied, which is quite not the case. The Italic hinterland has always remained by far also one of the most overwhelmingly populated in the Mediterranean. So really there was no country in the Mediterranean capable of colonizing such an intensely populated country like Italy, even at this point. If not for, in fact, entire mass migrations like the one of the Longobards in 568, it was literally the largest of the migration era. As we know, the Longobards, led by King Alboin, permanently settled in Italy, arriving from historically pretty far north Germanic regions across the centuries. Alboin had unified, together with his father, the broader Lombard people, that while maintaining, as we were recalling before, compared to the Goths, a great deal of autonomy and egalitarian spread of wealth, were in this sense, however, much more cohesive, because the final rank, Arimanus, was a pretty sort of self-aware warrior in terms of his participation to this level of liberty. And this people migrated into Italy together with other subjects they had conquered here and there, the Gepids, other sort of Romanized populations, and more, and established their dominance. As you know, the first generations were tough because basically Longobards lacked a permanent monarchic institution, but even more a sense of political and territorial control, typical of post-Roman Europe, that they had basically to learn the hard way under the Byzantine and Frankish attacks. In any case, the Longobard rule was organized down the line into numerous duchies, so ruled by chieftains known as duces that were at the head of the local clans, that installed themselves basically in all these heavily fortified Italian settlements. I mean, historically, again, Italy maintains an overwhelming material continuity with antiquity. It's by far the most advanced, urbanized, and probably thickly so, country in the Mediterranean, and basically in Europe and in the surroundings. And so the Longobards immediately follow, even in their initial fragmentation, that kind of specifically civilized direction of continuing the rule from the city, with some administrative personnel, soon essentially co-opted from the local Roman establishment, using local baths. This is a thing, and it's just like the broader temper of the time. It will contract further with Justinian plague and its rebootings. The early medieval society, just for a while, eventually kept rising again. So that even though this ducal rule was initially autonomous from any central authority, also because after the death of Alboin and his successor Clef for 10 years, 574, 584, there was so-called an anarchy where the Longobards collectively decided not to elect another king. Again, they had to think better afterwards, but essentially, the Longobards, in fact, do with authority at the end of the century. It's a relatively brief time, right? The distractions have been exaggerated. It mostly occurred in the context of open warfare with the Byzantine garrisons, as opposed to any need for distraction. Especially the Longobards were quite sort of ready in seizing territory. Obviously, they did not want to destroy it. So we'll talk more about Lombard Italy, because I, if anything, made lots of videos about the Lombard invasion and debunking a bit all the myths revolving around these people. And in general, you have different parts of the Lombard kingdom, as it would later compact, that people often think to have been simply sort of almost independent, as if the anarchy went on for a long time. This is the greatest mistake, that it's now 70 years old, historiographically speaking. If you fall into that, it means that you literally know nothing about the overwhelming amount, by the way, that has been written on Longobards later, and that today explicitly states that this was by far the most unitary Romano-Germanic kingdom in the entire West, and at some point actually even the greatest power at the end of the 7th century, when the Franks were fragmented into 4 kingdoms on their own. Abruzzo would, however, fall into a broader area that I also made a video on, the so-called Langobardia Minor, essentially the Duchy of Benevent and other Lombard principalities within it, which stood as, relatively separated, also because some Byzantine territory remained in between, from the Langobardia Minor revolving around Pavia, the Po Valley, and being in fact properly the seat of royal power. But there were Beneventan kings that were elected, ruled from Pavia, with no civil war, no issues whatsoever. So again, the myth that these areas were separated, they had nothing to do with one another, did not recognize, by the way, the Lombard is complete BS, and I don't know how many times I have to repeat this for anyone to solidly understand it. This is the explicitly macroscopical opposite in anything historiographically written in the last generations now, original authors being dead already generation because it's such a long time ago. Now, Abruzzo fell into the Langobardia Minor area, so on the Adriatic, so even more relatively isolated from itself. Admittedly, the more problematic part of the Langobardia Minor was in the north, the Duchy of Spoleto, that we also made a video about. That was perhaps the only exception of an otherwise pretty orderly Lombard rule, and simply because, a bit like Abruzzo, it was a bit of a sheltered reality in the Apennine Mountains in central Italy, and so playing sort of more provincially with the Byzantines sometimes against the other Longobards, but in fact not having the power to unhinge any of the Lombard kingdom political and territorial dimension, so much so that routinely the Lombard kings literally walked into Spoleto without even normally any major clash occurring in the campaign. Up until, the local duke or Gastal at the point died, and, local families re-elected somebody who did something different, and maybe this had to be repeated. In any case, by the latter half of the 6th century, a significant group of Germanic Longobards, there were other peoples within them, but largely they were Germanic, had settled in the Aterno Valley, and the Byzantine coastal cities as well, which initially withstood barbarian attacks, but essentially fell to the Duke of Benevent, Grimoald I, that was having a bit lion's share. We should also point out one interesting thing that we've already done in the video about the Longobards, is that especially the Beneventan one seemed to have actually been in Italy before the major Longobard invasion, as federati of Narses in particular, that had brought them from Dalmatia, right? And basically didn't even work as path openers because they simply wanted their autonomy. In fact, they rebelled to Byzantines as the other Longobards were coming in, which was also likely an agreed thing from the Byzantines that in fact didn't move a finger initially to halt the Longobard settlement into Italy, that had to serve as a sort of buffer area against the expanding Merovingian Franks. Now, the first city conquered by the Longobards in Abruzzo was Teramo, then called Castrum Abruziense, which is quite relevant because it literally means the Abruzzese castle. Part at the time of what was probably would also outline later as the Mark of Fermo, that is in the Marcus, however. This is interesting because, again, these areas that were not well politically separated or defined for centuries, right? Mostly, again, it's the more fragmented profile of the Adriatic side of Italy, with this more, again, mountainous interland that facilitated also further fragmentation. But that had, in fact, rivers, valleys, as one after the other flowing to the Adriatic. That was also very important as far as the Byzantine connection with Italy, and etc. The Marco Fermo stretched from the Musone to the Aterno River, and that's why the Longobard settlement into the latter basin was so sort of strategic, because it basically fortified its latter end against the Byzantine territory. And during this period, Lanciano, which we have before termed as Anxanum in Latin, was governed by the Duke Zotto, a Lombard leader overseeing this town's administration. These were properly cities rather than towns. Doesn't matter how smaller they generally were compared to the bigger other sort of Tuscan Lombard ones that would in fact evolve in some of the largest cities in medieval Europe. But they were properly civitates. And again, I can't stress enough how much Romanity flowed into this thing. And we explained how it's really a myth that the fact that the Longobards were among the most Germans of the Germans, which is absolutely true, by the way, would, however, simply erase Roman identity or basically not work along those patterns, right? Unfortunately, we see memes online, I said it also in other videos, where you realize that the only pages talking history, they're basically Romans versus Germans, still basically 101 underschooling for first world standards. That's not what happened. And that's especially not what happened in the most successful Romano-Germanic lands, such as probably the Lombard Italy. The city of Lanciano had been under Byzantine rule as well, of course, in the 6th century. It had been controlled by Narses. And there had already been a passage of Gothic and Lombard war bands here, also because some of the Goths had remained settled, especially in northern Italy, but in part also along the Apennines here, and eventually subsumed by the broader Lombard ethnos at this point. And the Byzantine administration had gradually evaporated from Lanciano, from Benevent, as we've seen. And this Lanciano was known as Anxanum, as we've seen, Castrum Lanzani or Anxani. So it had already a fortified profile by itself. Consider that there is, during the migration here, also late antiquity, further encastellation. We'll talk soon about this, by the way. And historically, because of all the vicissitudes of the land, there had been a general decline. The Lombard invasion in the moment did not help, because Samnium was invested as early as 568, and since these were still Byzantine-held territories, they were actually destroyed. Like Lanciano suffered the first destruction at the hand of the Longobards, with significant loss of Roman structures. Then, when the Longobards finally succeeded in seizing the settlement, of course, they rebuilt it and tried to preserve as much as the former Roman infrastructure existing. Starting with the general fortifications, which were, however, reinforced especially on the Armenia Hill, which tells you also like that Germanic ancestral term. This is essentially the old Lanciano district housing the core of Anxanum itself. So this was literally probably on the hilltop that historically the Italics had been ruling from. And Herminius, in fact, is a name derived from a local Lombard administrator, as the Germanic term also shows. And this is, again, very interesting and important because, again, these remain civitates, right, ruled by the Longobards now. The first churches of this area had included the St. George Chapel above Minerva, now the crypt of St. Biagio Church. We're talking Lanciano here. The St. Maurice Church that was demolished in the 19th century. This was located in a street known as the Largo dei Frentani, which bears the name of the Frentanians, were yet another Italic people that we also, again, discussed the other day as far as their naval exploit. You see, Abruzzo had naval potential historically since antiquity and had that portual development, as we realized also with the Byzantine fortification of these infrastructures. Pescara stems literally from the city of fish, like of fishing. And you have the Basilian convent of St. Legontianus outside the walls. That was mostly a Byzantine thing. That, however, sort of declined also in a broader Catholic, say Western, probably Roman, ecclesiastical dimension. A legend claims that in 610, during the fierce clashes between the Byzantines and the Longobards, the city was freed by its first patron, that is the aforementioned St. Maurice, after the people of the town, Lanciano, prayed to him, leading to a Lombard triumph over Byzantine oppression. And this narrative is beautiful because even though it's a legendary one, it shows what Italy absolutely subscribed to, that is to say, probably a Lombard upper hand on the system, still as a uniquely Roman and civilized country. So that's the single most important aspect we should stress. We should abandon this sort of involvistic, negationistic almost, and pessimistic and catastrophistic notion that, the Germans arrived and they did some harm to Rome. They kicked the Greeks out, right? That's what actually happened. Lombard Italy flourished as, again, one of the most advanced Romano-Germanic polities in Europe. And with a level of advancement absolutely comparable to the Byzantine one at the time. If not already, as we explained in other videos, more advanced under certain specific aspects. But again, it's all the more relevant considering that Saint Maurice is a Christian martyr as well as military saint, chosen in this sense for a military victory equated to a miracle as the city's first patron, like as an author of the same miracle. In 608, Pope Boniface IV passed through the Marsica. The pontiff had converted the Pantheon in Rome into a Christian church, right? Paul the Diacon's history of the Longobards provides details about this world, right, traversed by the same Pope. As a 8th century Lombard historian, as you know, he had chronicled the history of his people, and we're looking at a greater integration, in fact, in a properly Italian system, given that the papacy was tying the Longobards to a greater Catholic universal view of power, aside from their rapid and, or at least properly bloodless conversion to Catholicism from Arianism. The Longobards supported the popes against all the sort of Byzantine heretical, philheretical charades of the era. They established, since especially the age of Agilulf, and especially thanks to the Bavarian Queen Theodolinda, very amicable relations with the papacy. In fact, up until the mid-8th century, the papacy and the Longobards had some cordial relations, and again, there was nothing properly antagonistic about them. The Byzantines, if anything, were losing ground and sort of trying to literally kill popes that were sheltered by the Longobards. In many ways, also in probably the surrounding duchies, not even just from Pavia, but mostly the surrounding Longobards of central Italy. There were some parts of Abruzzo that we don't exactly know where they actually were seized by the Longobards. I mean, by the beginning of the 8th century, Marsica was properly reinvaded by the Beneventan Longobards of Count Gisulf II, who camped in Balsorano and then the Morea, persuading, in a sense, by Pope John VI's offerings to abandon his conquest, because still the papacy did maintain some relations with the Byzantines and did not really like wars being fought all around. Pope John VI's diplomacy was successful in the sense mitigating conflict and sort of consolidating also a general Lombard settlement of the peninsula. Records exist of the early Marsican diocese with its seat in Sora and San Rufino in Trasacco. The territorial framework of Abruzzo, largely within the late imperial suburbicarian region, so it means basically central southern Italy, remained intact, interestingly enough, despite the Gothic war's devastation of many cities, splitting Abruzzo between the duchies of Spoleto and Benevent. The Duchy of Benevent included, as we've seen, Samnium, so properly the part, the Apennine hinterland and the Adriatic watershed, Campania, excluding at least Naples and Pozzuoli, in part had been controlled by the Byzantines and or by local, sort of more autonomous Lombard dukes, and Lucania. these territories were bordered in the north by the Duchy of Spoleto, to the east by the Ofanto and the Adriatic, to the west by Lazio and the Duchy of Naples. If you're interested, I made also a video about medieval Lazio that partly discusses this. In the south, you have the Busento River and the Ionian Sea, by the way, and so also the Byzantine frontier. For over 2 centuries, Samnium included the Frentania, so the lands of the ancient Frentani, which roughly covered the Abruzzese districts of Larino, Lanciano, and Vasto, that were essentially under Beneventan authority. Of course, the local Lombard leaders were fundamentally autonomous, even in that sense, but they were part of this broader bulk. But Duchy of Benevent was huge, right? It was, in a sense, mirroring a greater level of power concentration that derived from some more straightforward Romanized background of the Longobards as they had first seized this territory. As we've seen, they had started as garrisons, and these areas were historically sort of even more advanced than other parts of the north. At least here the tide is turning a bit, and in fact the extension of the Duchy of Benevent is also indicative eventually of some broader sort of decline of specific local polities, whereas paradoxically the duchies and gastaldates of the center and the north of the peninsula will be subsumed, coped properly in the framework of a more unitary kingdom, developing a more orderly pattern on the basis of the older Roman civitates. Here things were sort of instead more fragmented. The Longobards, as we've seen, had also occupied the Marsica, Chieti, so this area of Abruzzo Citerior, Molise, that was just historically a county, right? The historical county of Boianum. Today, this is an Italian region. At the time, it was basically attached to Abruzzo. You have the Daunia of Foggia. This reached up to Apulia, essentially the gates of Apulia, and Lucania. Right, there are very important differences between these lands interland, where it's fundamentally a Pannonic, Italic, and the essentially few coastal urban ports that the Byzantines still retained partial control of, and not quite, in fact, in the demographic and majority, in this sense, population-wise, Italian interland. That is instead Longobardized. Between 740 and 743, the Mark of Fermo was subdued by the Duchy of Spoleto, along with the County of Abruzzium, which had become the Gastaldate of Abruzzium, one of the 7 Gastaldates of the Abruzzian Middle Ages, including Marsica, Amiternum, Forcona, Valva, Teate Chieti, Penne, and probably the Abruzzium, as we've seen. This is very interesting because normally the Gastaldates were a royal institution. Essentially, the Gastald was a royal official that was installed at the basically removal or extinction of the local ducal dynasty. And so it mostly in central northern Italy stands for just like a form of centralized royal measure. This is happening relatively tidily in, again, places like the Po Valley, Tuscany, so again, the more developed part, probably the bulk of the Longobard kingdom, even in terms of direct control of the Longobard king. In these areas, the Duchy of Spoleto, Duchy of Benevent, in Longobardia Minor, this seems to proceed mostly from the imitation of some Roman Byzantine models. And true, as we've seen, this needs of also decentralized control, because these territories were quite wide, but not overwhelmingly compact. Like Benevent was a big center, was very difficult to take. The Byzantines tried to besiege it and failed. Spoleto was powerful and similarly well entrenched, especially in the Apennine mountains. But in this sense, all these various local duchies or gastaldates were historically to remain autonomous. If you study, for example, this area in the 13th, 14th century, we'll make more videos about these places. I explained this in the video about the Duchy of Spoleto partially, but What I mean is that there were different communes who were autonomous from one another. They were powerful on their own. There was, here we're talking, of course, the early Middle Ages still, so still these lands were exhausted, a bit like the entire Eurasian beyond in general sort of surplus capacity, etc. But they were also reviving, especially in the 8th century. And so the appointment of these Gastals was a form of political delegation from the Dukes of Spoleto and Benevent, that however controlled this enormous territory that was de facto ruled by these local lords, or any form of the Gastald, that thus was not much recognized formally as a local dynasty, as a duke, or just, however, someone who could actually wield that power, but some sort of, again, administrative figure that de facto also lived in a more sort of private and autonomous fashion from, in de facto as a duke, like a bit like by northern Italian standards. The Duchy of Spoleto controlled the Gastals in the area between the Marsica and the territory north of the Aterno River, now Pescara, and the Beneventan Duke instead roughly the province of Teata Chieti. In the Lombard system, the Gastald, or castle, depending on how it would be eventually written down in sources, was responsible for the entire government of the district, right? Civil, military, and judicial affairs were in his hands. It's really typical of the Lombard dukes, Gastals, to be literate, to preside over courts of justice, to be really fully rounded governors, right? Also in a civil sense, very differently from what was happening north of the Alps, by the way. And this shows actually the already very advanced civil level of medieval Italy in the early Middle Ages that the Longobards fully embraced, by the way, against the myth of the barbarians. A period of calm in Lanciano followed, allowing trade in ceramics and market fairs to revive. In the 8th century, you have also the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano occurring at the monastery of Saint Legontianus and Domitianus, built, as we've seen before, outside the city walls over a chapel, on the supposed birthplace of Longinus, the Roman soldier traditionally believed to have pierced Christ's side on the cross. This is also very interesting, connecting the local identity to probably the Italic ancestry of the local population in this biblical and ancient stories. And an unfaithful Basilian monk, doubting the resurrection, witnessed the host turning into living flesh and the wine chalice drip human blood during the Eucharist, bringing significant religious prestige to the monks in the city. You have always this Byzantine element that does not align with the Catholic reality. And I understand Christianity had properly embraced the Catholic spirit of these lands, and it grew stronger in Lanciano. That had definitely also Byzantine legacy in this, as we've just seen, but that was also in the Byzantine-controlled areas becoming ever more Italianized and osmotically similar to the Lombard ones. Made multiple videos explaining the social and economical changes of Byzantine Italy, especially at this point in history when the Lombards had the upper hand. The Byzantines had, by the 30s of the 7th century, given up any sort of greater hope of reconquest, and that gradual Lombard Italian mentality had been consolidating along this still Romano-Italic backbone of the peninsula. Also in the 8th century, the Marsica was largely controlled, this is very important, by the Monte Cassino Abbey. As you know, prominent Benedictine monasteries, at least founded by the same Saint Benedict, in which, along with Farfa and Saint Vincent on the Volturner monasteries, that were all a bit close, because Farfa and Sabinus and Saint Vincent is really close also to Abruzzo as the crow flies, were really some of the heartland, the spiritual point of reference of probably this continental Italic dimension. and that also held jurisdiction over churches throughout Abruzzo. And the fact that Monte Cassino was that connected with land is quite fascinating, spiritually speaking. In 782, the Duke Hildebrand of Spoleto gifted the Marsica entire to the Monte Cassino monastery. Right, this reflects in a moment of basically fall of the Lombard kingdom, or at least the loss of its independence and the Carolingian takeover, typical patrimonial strategy of providing the church with this broader areas in exchange for protections, because when the Franks arrived, especially the Spoletians were quite quick at sort of passing to the Roman side and saying, okay, well, if we dedicate ourselves to the church, we will avoid at least a direct Carolingian control, because, as you know, the papacy had already started negotiating with the Franks this sort of not just political but spiritual partition of Italy, like what kind of, at least at a lay and ecclesiastical level, what does really pertain to the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, what does pertain to the Italic kingdom now ruled by the Carolingians. And all this in a context where, as you know, Italy would become central to the imperial title as well. But it's really interesting that this Comitatum Marsorum, as it appears in the Lombard source, at least in the Lombard donation to the Roman Church, is further tied to a papal aegis, so to say. During the 8th and the 9th centuries, by the way, new patterns in territorial settlement were starting, right? First of all, the Carolingians injected that vassalatic beneficiary system that was still being, fully engineered and institutionalized within the broader Frankish world, that conferred way more power to individual counts, that were basically the Carolingian equivalent of the Lombard dukes. At least to some degree, it is not quite entirely true, but to make the long story short, there were in fact also duchies and marks in Italy that in fact gathered more counties that were in fact in the hands of particularly also important Carolingian families coming probably from the Frankish ethnic heartland, because these were immense territories of immense strategic importance. I made a video about the Carolingian rule of Italy and also something about the Carolingian Empire frontiers. There was still a strong Lombard presence and feeling. After the Carolingian conquest, some Lombards were sponsored by the Byzantines as well, paradoxically, to sort of try to reacquire some control. So Abruzzo laid a bit in the frontier of this all, because although generally fitting, at least at this point, into a broader, at least not having been hegemonized by any southern Italian power, which will happen only from the Normans onwards, mostly revolved around, in fact, the Carolingian Empire that had the upper hand. But as also mountainous area, it was difficult to control, and so the Carolingians struggled to impose their presence there in order to essentially control the area without a direct occupation of some places. Of course, this is all blended, in as much as the same Frankish nobility that also in part married with the Lombard one was to entrench itself in that typical vassalatic beneficiary fashion in these areas, and that at the end of, in fact, of the 8th century will fundamentally autonomize themselves from an evaporating empire as well. Now, this, by the way, regime change, let's say from the Franks to the Lombards, did bring disruption. That had been wars, there had been some general issues here, realignment with different powers, especially these Apenninic lands dedicating themselves to the papacy increasingly. They did not even have quite a great direct grip on these territories, because the Pope at most controlled the region around Lazio, mostly, around Rome. But as you've seen, it's all about clienteles, right? And so cities that in these areas had been partially preserved also by a continuation of the late antiquity, it doesn't matter how sort of shrunk compared to classical times they were now absorbed into a de facto nascent feudal system, which would privilege certain centers as opposed to others, and especially in these territories that were not so strongly urbanized as Lombardy and Tuscany, also give way to a more sort of agrarian economy, at least more feudal system, that in fact will characterize later also the rest of Abruzzese history, even more after the Normans came about and took over everything. We will see this, if anything, in a next episode. There were also some servile communities that de facto lived, even though there had been an emancipation of probably from serfdoms to Massari in the late Lombard era. The Carolingians brought to some sort of heavier conditions. The society became more stratified. This process of gradual feudalization of the system. So these people mostly handled the clearing and farming of land from the ancient Roman civic agri or villas, now ruled over by an increasingly elitary establishment. Peasants were granted some autonomies due to the rising costs of acquiring slaves, but without political independence, these communities fell under the authority, protection, and land rights of feudal lords and abbeys, including the ones that we've seen, at least initially Monte Cassino and St. Vincent on the Volturno, and later St. Clements in Casauria, established in 871. This is interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is that Italy had really not witnessed much slavery, nor we can say that things were evolving toward that direction. If anything, the opposite was true. But as you understand here, and I made a video about the increasing power of the church in Carolingian Italy, and these very powerful monasteries become veritable landlords. And so that more early medieval scattered freeman kind of type, this is true for most of Europe, basically. At this point, starts go under again. Some more powerful aristocracy and elite. All right. And all these lay lords around donate land to these abbeys because at some point we're also having family members as abbots in the same. There's also a connection with Campania, which is quite fascinating from the other side. And in fact, they're not very far away, even though Abruzzo is consistently different from that land in a broader cultural sense. Political fragmentation and the need to consolidate populations for more efficient management of lands being reclaimed drove to the creation of further castra. We are, after all, in the 9th and 10th century, the age of encapsulation, with fortified centers built around also the older strongholds already, showing early signs of lordship or landed aristocracy in the probably feudal, in the full feudal sense. This is interesting because Abruzzo has, as we were saying before, quite a lot of castles all across the mountain passes. Examples include Balsorano, Castel di Sangro, Capestrano, Celano, Massa d'Alba. Interestingly enough, these were all incredibly historically overloaded centers, right? Think about the Romans, and in archaic Italy have to conquer stronghold after stronghold here against Italic tribesmen. The same Tagliacozzo that would be the theater of the aforementioned battle of 1268 that would change probably the destiny of Europe. And consider that that place existed, for example, and the later city of L'Aquila, in the province of which it would lay, did not. L'Aquila was the name of eagle, probably the settlement founded in the Abruzzese heartland by the Hohenstaufen to properly control this massive sort of mountainous hinterland that was often escaping, in fact, the kingdom of Naples, direct occupation. But you have also Alanno, Popoli Terme Salle, Tocco da Casauria in the province of Pescara, Bisenti, Borello Casoli, Canzano in the provinces of Teramo and Chieti, These are all castles, right? And there were many more, telling the truth, right? There would have been hundreds for hundreds of square kilometers, but here just were some of the most important rocks. There are amazing landscapes in this region, dotted, in fact, by these old fortifications. The coastal cities of Chieti and Pina also endured as actual, strongholds along the coast. There is all a history of naval activity, as we were saying before, also in the early Middle Ages. There are the Longobards, also the Slavic pirates at a point. In general, Abruzzo was somehow a warlike place, because this is what happens along the Apennines. Even though they were not the most powerful places, they had sort of a more archaic, traditional mentality scattered down the line with sort of militarized government and retinues at this point, ever more evolving towards the Masnata. Besides, this had been a veritable frontier in Lombard times that had left probably the mark over also a Byzantine presence. Abruzzo still shows traces of Lombard presence, such as place names with prefixes like Gualdo, Fara, Guardia, and Scurcola. We'll talk more about this because I'm preparing a video about probably the fortifications of Lombard Italy. And these were also in part literal Lombard warrior colonies at the beginning of the settlement. They're typical Germanic terms indicating ownership or control points on elevated terrain. Scurcola is properly the name also of the place where the Battle of Tagliacozzo was actually fought, because Tagliacozzo is the town, but the bigger center around. But the place exactly what was fought was exactly this older Lombard settlement, where towers and small forts were built, by the way, later becoming settlements. This is the case for Fara Filiorum Petri, Fara San Martino. You understand, Fara comes from Fahren, from the Fahrgemeinschaften of the Germanic warriors of the migration era. Guardia Glere, so from guard properly. Vasto, then known as Vastum, which was probably a hilltop or over the sea, overlooking the coast, and it's a beautiful place with old medieval buildings, and there's a marina now that gives you the idea of how properly the Longobards dominated from the promontory, the coastland. Guastameroli as well. So Lombard traditions also persist, such as the Farche festival, or in the local folklore in Fara Filiorum Petri, honoring Saint Anthony the Abbot, and churches dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel, the Longobards' patron saint. That probably etheric, military, Vodanic figure, right, associated with, of course, the biblical legacy, including Saint Angel in Vetuli near Sulmona. There are caves dedicated to Saint Angel, which refers to Saint Michael, in Palombaro, Civitella del Tronto, and Letto Manopello, as well as parishes in Lombard-founded villages like Sant'Angelo del Pesco, Città Sant'Angelo, Tessa Lanciano, the Borgo district, Mosciano Sant'Angelo, and the Church of St. Michael in St. Vittorino of L'Aquila. So it's really a massive Lombard legacy in actually a territory that it's not like, again, had any particularly strong Lombard power, but it tells you how down the line this impacted the local culture and mentality. And this is curious because, again, very often this influence is stronger in this kind of more frontier areas, in part probably because they were a bit more strategic, and so the Longobards settled there were less people, and so the Germans also had a greater impact on that. Without mentioning that there were Ostrogoths, as we've seen, other peoples that had settled perhaps in the same identical places in the centuries before. By the way, when you talk about Saint Michael Archangel, always bear in mind that this symbol was incredibly powerful. Apparently the angelic iconography in coins, we know that archaeologically, was spread by the Gepids as an Eastern Germanic people, because this all came from the rising sun of the steppe also of the Ostrogothic tradition. Then it was passed onto the Longobards, even the Justinian Empire, exactly at the time of the Lombard migration. And later, the same Normans were obsessed with this, so much so that Mont Saint-Michel, Saint Michael of in the Susa Valley, and in fact, the relatively close here sanctuary of Saint Michael on Gargano Promontory Peninsula are some of the most important sanctuaries in High Medieval Europe, all tied through this Michaelic cult. Besides, as we were saying before, aside from Abruzzo, that if anything, we'll make a video about Molise at some point, but this did not, at the time, it was not really separated from the same, and can be included here, had in the town of Capracotta, that in fact was part of Abruzzo until 1948, because it's a very recent thing that Molise was a region in Italy, has Lombard roots tied to the custom of sacrificing a goat in a colonized land. Literally, because capra means goat in Italian. And in cotta, I don't know whether the etymology is, I think it's cooked or something like that, but I'm not sure it's part of the sacrifice, but that's quite an important connection. In contrast to the abandonment of major Roman cities like Albafucans, Amiternum, and Corfinium, these were all very famous centers. Corfinium was famously enough during the Roman civil wars, also theater of a major siege, around which the Gastaldates were formed. Sulmona, Lanciano, and Chieti maintain an urban layout in their historic centers and still largely mirrored, in fact, the Roman road network. This is quite fascinating because even though some Roman cities do decline, and there were really many in Italy, including some that nobody has ever studied because they never dug into them, but basically archaeology is finding out that aside from the veritable obsession for classical antiquity, there is an overwhelming amount of early medieval, late antique cities of enormous size that nobody ever dug because you wanted to dug just the stuff from probably classical times. That's archaeology, unfortunately, follows the money, and it's actually a despicable field, both ideologically and morally speaking. But this basically is showing us that there was not just a great continuity in urbanization from one side, also rises and falls at others, but that the major, say, at least some of the major centers that survive in the early Middle Ages, also ruled by the Longobards, etc., are essentially of Roman tradition. So there isn't much of a redrawing of that. There is a leveling during the moment of greatest crisis, but not an abandonment at least in an absolute sense. And even those centers that reemerge as more important than what had been the major ones are actually Roman, of course, in tradition. Now, in 801, the Franks entered the Samnium. That's how it happened, right? We're talking about Charlemagne's times. There had already been some Frankish infiltrations in Italy back in the day, and we don't know how many errant knights had reached Abruzzo. But the most sort of straightforward affirmation of Carolingian rule witnessed also the overcoming of some harsh local resistance, which brought, in fact, to the forcible conquest and destruction of Chieti. That also survived, but literally, did not like the conquest and, in fact, resisted, as many Longobards actually did. And I made a video about the Battle of the Livenza River that is in northeastern Italy, but it illustrates, in fact, how resourceful the Longobards actually were and how much the Carolingians had actually to cope with them even after they had destroyed the, Desiderius and his main following. Lanciano, in all of this, remained neutral. They prefer essentially to avoid violence, partly because he already was under Chieti's administration, so this was a chance to break free from the latter with the Frankish forces destroying it. And it would essentially be annexed to the Duchy of Spoleto, which previously did not control this There are also some broader redrawings of the boundaries of the Duchy of Benevent. Remember, the Duchy of Spoleto is fully within the Italic kingdom, whereas the Duchy of Benevent, so-so, really. This is interesting because the Duchy of Spoleto at least had been more centrifugal in Lombard time, but it fully becomes part of the Italic kingdom. Whereas and also a pillar of Ghibelline tradition, as we've seen. Whereas the Duchy of Benevent remains a bit more detached, a bit more in between the Byzantines and the Franks, but it also loses some parts. And there is also, through the feudalization of those territories, some chunks that part a bit, like Salerno, Capua, will move away from Benevent, because they become simply more powerful. There is more surplus, where in the 9th century things are improving, and this breaks apparently the sort of, you would see this as a crisis. It wasn't like just in early medieval times. You see this big, powerful territories, like, I don't know, the entire Merovingian power, the entire Ostrogothic power, and so on, the Visigothic kingdom. But a lot of control was in name only. Right, it's in high medieval times that resources start booming, and also local powers, in fact, still can autonomize themselves from the bigger ones because they have more resources, but still building the latter the former from the bottom up, basically. We enter also a delicate time, one of the second invasions. The Magyars, for example, would reach even southern Italy in some of their far-ranging attacks. As you know, they arrived up to northeastern France, northern Spain, even. And the Longobards even successfully beat the Magyars when they were there. At some point, they ambushed them, and the Beneventans probably seized all the loot that these Hungarians were bringing back to the Pannonian Plain. In 926, the early well-defined territorial system of the later County of the Marsica, or Celano, that would become an important polity, maybe at least within this provincial context. We are, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, probably making lots of, we're going to make lots of videos about smaller polities as we exhaust the bigger ones. But you never end, really, in medieval Europe to look at this kind of sceneries. In this case, will be founded at this point, at least in a seigneurial sense. The Berardi family starts in the 10th century, as many medieval dynasties in this moment of central feudalization, dynastization of power, after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire. The Berardi, in fact, acquire under certain Francis the county of the Marsic. This Berard, this is named actually Berard of Francis, was a nobleman who administered the region. Counts were now basically after the Carolingian model, the basic local rulers, right, in the districtuation of the country. We are in the times of Hugh of Arles. I made a video about the Italian opposition to this ruler. There's a quite interesting figure also operating in Italy, in Rome, and therefore being close to Abruzzo, unavoidably, even though the greater power here is the Duke of Spoleto, that in fact that's not quite like Hugh, that has mostly its center of power in Italy, in the Mark of Tuscany. He ruled, as you know, in Italy from 926 to 947. He was a provincial ruler. There is also later recognition of the County of Marsica under the Berardi at the time of Otto I of Saxony, that managed to reconnect at least the Eastern Frankish kingdom with Italy and obtaining the imperial crown. In fact, confirming many of the local noblemen's rights to, in this case, specifically hold the Saracen raids in Abruzzo. Essentially, the Pope summoned Frankish efforts to curb like the Saracen infiltrations mostly occurred because local Southern Italian noblemen, including the Longobards, called these guys as mercenaries, and then they ended up looting some places. And here there is an old history. Here we are also making it very simple compared to, for example, the various Carolingian rulers, what they did with Abruzzo, and because this is an incredibly delicate frontier area for many reasons, as you can explain, between Byzantines, the Longobards. Alongside these Berardi came Atto, a nobleman who took control of the county of Chieti as well, founding the homonymous county and the Attonid dynasty, one of the region's most powerful, lasting until the 12th century. It gives you an idea of the wealth, actually, of these feudal families and their capacity to collect, like in other parts of post-Carolingian Europe, county after county, and merging them into some broader principality. In 973, the Mark of Chieti was, probably of the Teatine, was established because Chieti was within it and was most important center, but it also had Lanciano, for example, under its jurisdiction. In the 11th century, there was a notable example of Byzantine Lombard influence in the site of Arsita in the province of Teramo. The so-called Bacucco Castle, there was probably a medieval fortified settlement where eventually an 18th century palace was built later in the 18th century. And standing at the village's summit, a typical skyline of the Abruzzese mountain, this castle was a settlement of huts and branches, oval in shape, possibly deriving its name from even the Arabic, even though the Arabs didn't really have much of an influence in these areas, but it could come from bakok burku, a cloth wrapping the head, reflecting the castle's perched appearance. However, it's just an hypothesis. Under Byzantine's control, it became known as Arsit, a name suggesting a burned place, likely due to later Norman raids. Today, we essentially, from a conceptual point of view, stop to ideally the end of the Lombard era, right? In Abruzzo. So even technically, the Carolingian side we will deepen better in another video. But you know, in the longer run, what is going to happen? The Normans will take over Abruzzo. And one of the most we also make a video about the county of Celano, as a matter of fact. It gives you also a dimension of what the Normans really did in southern Italy for many reasons. Abruzzo came to be the northern frontier of the same Norman territory, and there were individual Norman knights who literally seized control of incredibly wide areas. Like by these local standards, it was just really too big because Italy did not have really the level of Western Frankish feudal development. Even just by social standards, as we've seen, that they had a more egalitarian profile with the higher per capita wealth and sort of political autonomy. But Abruzzo will largely fall under, in fact, the feudalization of southern Italy under the Normans, which was very iron-fisted and literally taking over immense areas, estates altogether, something stretching several tens of kilometers that was sort of and beyond it, that was really something incredible by also the local nobiliary standards. But we'll see this better in another video. If anything, from a spiritual point of view, what happened from the Lombard times, we've seen there had been the Eucharistic miracle of the Church of Lanciano. This was entrusted eventually to the Benedictines by the 12th century. Where at the time of Innocent III, the peak of Roman Catholicism, the guy who initiated the Fourth Crusades, and that expelled the Basilians for impiety. So the Byzantines are literally kicked out of Abruzzo. You understand how really really foreign to Italy the Byzantines really were in many ways. The monastery came under the Abbey of St. John in Venus. This is quite fascinating because the Basilian monks survived in some parts of southern Italy under the Normans. I explained this also in the video about probably the Norman rule in southern Italy during probably the first generations of the settlement. Naturally, there the Greek influence had been stronger historically. There were also much bigger Basilian monasteries, but at the end of the day, again, even in those southernmost areas, the hinterland was overwhelmingly, disproportionately Italic, Roman, Latin, Catholic, whatever you want to stress, because at that point the Great Schism, the so-called Great Schism, had already happened. By the way, in 1252, the Franciscan Conventual Friars of St. Francis of Assisi, the founder of the Franciscan order in the early 13th century, known for his commitment to poverty and nature. I made a video about him, of course, but we have to talk way more about it. Arrived in Lanciano. That would be an important change historically. And we mentioned them so late in the Middle Ages because they actually reconstructed the church of the Eucharistic miracle in Lanciano. Naturally, also with the architectural styles of the era. And in fact, again, this is a very important, also spiritual, religious center, and that illustrates the very old tradition of Abruzzese Christendom, right? And again, something that constitutes yet another tacit of the great imperial Roman Catholic mosaic in one of the most beautiful lands in Europe, really Abruzzo. I had the luck in my life to visit it. I think it's sort of a secondary region, but it actually has a lot, right? And that's what we tend to sort of overlook, how replete. You have all these on X. I see all these this accounts posting pictures of, oh, look, medieval stuff. It's always the same bunch of things they can find on Wikipedia. Just like they never really look at the heartland, so to say, properly of real and actual culture that is something much deeper and much more widespread, right? Looking at just the bigger cathedral, yeah, it's cool and should be pushed, but look at how much existed to support that everywhere, and especially in some parts of Europe. Like this is, I think, is one of the most important aspect of this story. That's also why I'm glad to have covered Abruzzo in this general overview, because it does give you a dimension of this land in the early Middle Ages, and we will continue with its story in other videos. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.